turn to Revelation chapter 8, and we are going to look at the third trumpet. Can someone read for me Revelation 8, verse 10 to 11?
And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter.
Now, as we've looked at previously, the trumpets are given in the context of God's judgment against Rome for their persecuting his people. And so this third judgment, this third announcement of judgments coming, is seen as a star falling from heaven on a third part of the rivers and fountains, turning them into wormwood. So the first question we have to ask is what does a star represent? What's the meaning of a star in prophecy? Well, just throughout scriptures, what does a star mean? And we're going to have a look at a few verses here. First off, I would like to turn to Revelation 22. Revelation 22. And can someone read for me verse 16?
I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright and morning star.
So there in Revelation, who's being described as a star, or what is a star in that context?
Jesus. He's the root and offspring of David and the bright and morning star.
So Jesus is presenting himself as the morning star, as one of the things that's used to describe himself. And if we jump back into the Old Testament, into the book of Isaiah 14, and can someone read verse 12? Because often the one symbol can have more than one meaning. So you got to look at all of its meanings, and then to find some harmony about what is being meant here in the trumpets.
How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?
Yes, Merlene.
Hello.
Hello, how you going?
Just joining in.
Yep.
I can't seem to get everybody on the screen or me on the screen.
Well, we'll say hello instead. It's good to have you with us.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello, Marg.
Oh.
You can't see me?
No.
I don't know how to do that. I'm sorry, I'm mucking up your meeting here.
No worries. No worries. Good to have you.
Thank you.
So there in Isaiah 14:12, when it speaks about how thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, does anyone have a different translation or a different margin reading for that?
O day star.
Yep.
A day star sounds like the sun, because it's the star that shows up in the daytime.
Yes. However, that's sort of a more modern scientific understanding of
Too literal.
What stars are.
Too literal. Sorry.
Yeah, I my understanding of the day star, or even the morning star, that this is referring, well, most probably referring to actually the planet Venus, because it was the star that you could still see in the morning, you know, the brightest one. In the book of Jude, we're going to turn to in a minute, it talks about wandering stars, and that's what they used to refer to as planets, because you looked up in the sky, like all the stars moved in certain, you know, the same predictable arcs, but there were these other ones that didn't follow that sort of wandered around the sky in their own paths, and they were planets called wandering stars. So, you know, it speaks about the sun, the moon, and the stars, with the 3 divisions. So that, yeah, a lot of the planets were just considered stars because that's how they appear in the sky. A star wasn't this technical definition of a giant ball of gas. It was those tiny lights in the sky.
I like the idea of the planets being called wandering stars. I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid, and it's interesting watching the movement of the planets over you know, the year and what have you, and as they move, and then they go into retrograde, which means they move back. It looks like they're moving backwards. It's just when the Earth overtakes them. And it's just interesting when, yeah, like the planets all of a sudden move backwards in their position in the sky, and it's so, yeah, wandering star. I like that. I've never associated that before, but that's really cool.
And I suppose this comes from sort of something we were discussing the other day. A lot of times that these things were described how they appeared, not necessarily how they actually were. You know, the definition of a star would be this tiny dots of light you see in the sky. So under that definition, planets and these stars are the same thing, and the sun does not classify as one of those because it's a giant ball of light, not a tiny pinprick of light. Yeah, so that was how the word was used back then, not necessarily how we use it now with our modern classifications. But as it's saying here in Isaiah 14:12, what is the star referring to, or who is it referring to?
It actually refers to Satan or Lucifer.
Yep. And so that seems like quite a contrast. In Revelation, Christ is a morning star, and here Lucifer is a day star, son of the morning. And so we seem to have it's referring to, in different contexts, it can refer to both Christ and Satan. Turn to Job.
What about verse 13?
Yeah.
For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of heaven. Is that just referring to all the angels, or is that the actual, like heavens above the stars? Or
I would include that as referring to the angels.
Oh yeah.
It's also interesting, if you go 13 to 14, it's all in poetic parallels. The central part of that is, I will sit also upon the mount of the congregations in the sides of the north. Right, and the phrase said before that is, I will exalt my thrones above the stars of God, and the one after that is, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. So Satan's ascending above the stars of God and the heights of the clouds. Now it's interesting. You said stars referring to angels, but clouds are also referred to as angels. When Christ is speaking of his second coming, in his trials, he says, you know, that you will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And in another gospel, he says coming with, you know, all of his Father's angels. In Daniel 7, he approaches the Father. He's brought with him with, you know, the clouds. There's this sort of cloud of angels following him around. So both stars and clouds are symbols for angels. So there's so in the central statement, he's saying, I will also sit upon the Mount of Congregations in the side of the north. He wants to sit where God's throne is. Then in the statement before and after that, he's saying, I want to ascend myself above all the other created beings, above all the other angels of God. And then the opening one, I will ascend into heaven. And the final one, I will be like the Most High. Satan wanting to be like God, wanting to be where God is, like he is. And so there's just an interesting parallel that runs through that again shows the stars of God's, the clouds of heaven, the heights of the clouds is speaking of the same thing in parallel. And if we turn to, we'll jump back into Revelation 12 actually. Just going on from what you mentioned there about the stars being the angels of God. In Revelation 12, can somebody read for me verse 4?
And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born.
Now, what is the stars here referring to? Or rather, we'll start with who is the dragon?
The devil, Satan.
Yep. And we find that down in verse 9.
When
we read, and the dragon, which was cast out, that old serpent called the dragon, called the devil and Satan, which deceived the world, he was cast out to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And so if the dragon is the devil that was cast out, who are these stars?
Angels.
That fell with him. Yep, absolutely. And it mentions that there again in verse 9, that the angels that were cast out with him. And here in verse 4, the dragon took a third of the stars of heaven, a third of the angels with him when he fell. Galen.
I find it interesting that okay, in verse 4 it says, drew the third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them down to the earth. But in verse 9, they're his angels. His angels, I presume, because the one that we follow is the one that we serve. He is master. So because they have chosen to follow him, they are his, because they are his servants in that regard. I know Jesus talks about it somewhere. I think he might be talking to the Pharisees or something. Yeah, it's that verse, the one with servants in it, and that's all I've got. But yeah, it reminds me of that.
Yeah, is that you cannot serve God and mammon? Either you will love one and hate the other, or hate one and love the other.
No, it's the one to do with, I think it's to do with sin, and you are the servant of the master you choose, or something. I'm paraphrasing, but I know it's got the word whose servant you are, or something to that effect in it.
Yeah.
It's that one.
Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness.
Yeah, that one.
Romans 6:16. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's that one. So maybe it wasn't the one that Christ said. I thought it was the one Jesus said. Never mind. But yeah.
Well, he says similar things. It's all the same.
Yeah.
That same message. But like you said, it's yes. They chose to follow him. That they were his angels. He became their master. It's the same thing with the fallen Adam and Eve. If God hadn't intervened, and it said that he put enmity between, it says, thee and the woman, thy seed and her seed. God had to interfere into that and put enmity between us and the devil Otherwise, the entire human race would have been completely on Satan's side. But he put something in us that could resist his power and his deceptions. You know, he gave us that, whether you want to call it that conscience, that part of us that, you know, recognizes truth when we hear it, that the Holy Spirit can work upon to bring us to repentance. If God hadn't interfered to put us there, when Adam and Eve, you know, sinned and they followed Satan, the entire race would have been his. And so here in Revelation, when Satan, it says that he casts a third of the angels or a third of the stars down to the ground, you know, it's because they believed his lie, that they were cast out of heaven because of him. But in verse 9, as you're mentioning, they were cast out with him. It's on top of what you just said, it's also the idea that is spoken of in the fourth angel's message, that come out that you be not partakers. They were cast out with him because they believed him and they didn't separate themselves from his lies, and so they were held guilty and judged by it because they stood by him. And so we need to, you know, the message goes out to us to come out of Babylon, to come out of those systems, to make a stand for what we know to be truth. Otherwise, just like them, we will be judged with these fallen systems because we have allowed ourselves to be partakers with them.
So it's all choices, yeah?
Turn to Job. (38) verse 7.
Sorry, Matthew, what was the chapter and verse?
Job 38 verse 7.
And the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy.
So what is this verse referring to? When is this set? And who are these people involved in this? Or who are the beings involved?
Well, God's confronting Job here.
Just before it's at creation, isn't it?
Yep. Where do you get that from?
Where are you when the foundations thereof fastened, or who laid the cornerstone thereof?
Yep.
Foundations of the earth. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So God's confronting Job. He's speaking about creation of this earth. And at the beginning of the creation, there are these beings called the morning stars that sang together, and the sons of God that shouted for joy. And so the question is, the stars here, who could they be referring to?
Angels.
Yep.
Is there a difference then between stars and morning stars?
I think that the morning star is just a way to talk about the sort of the brightest star, you know, because a lot of stars you can't see, you know, unless you got to wait till it gets really dark.
Yep.
But there's some stars you wake up early in the morning, the sun starts rising, you can still see a few stars in the sky. They're shining bright enough that they can last into the morning, before they disappear. And so the morning stars just refers to the brightest stars.
I like that parallel for the angels, because they are holy angels, and they also reflect the Father's glory and the Son's glory. And I presume then, because they are holy angels, they have obviously some of their own.
Isn't Jesus referred to somewhere as a bright and morning star?
Yep. Yep, that's in Revelation 22, verse 16. At the end of he speaks to himself as being the written offspring of David and the bright and morning star.
He's also Michael the Archangel too, so.
Petra.
Victoria's put in the chat Revelation 2:28. I will give him the morning star. Jesus talking.
Yep. So that is in the message to the church in Thyatira. And in verse 26 is talking about the promise to them that overcomes and keeps his word unto the end. I will give him power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. As a vessel of the potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I have received of my Father. And I will give him the morning star. He that hath an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the churches. So as part of that promise that is given to the overcomers in the church of Thyatira, what is the significance of Jesus saying, I will give them the morning star?
He will give them himself. Because it's he that overcomes, so it's a result. It's the after effects, the reward, I suppose. And then would that not be their reward in heaven? Himself as to spend your eternity, obviously, with him. Just as a guess.
Okay, Petra.
2 Peter 1:19. We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well that ye take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts.
Was this the beginning of the Reformation as well? He'd be more.
Are you referring to the Thyatira?
Yeah. How he was going to be showing more to the world at that time, or?
Yeah, it's that transition. From Thyatira to Sardis is where we see the Reformation starting to take place. One thing I notice when I look at this promise to the overcomer here, is it just speaks about to him that overcome, I will give power over the nations. Okay, and then it talks about ruling them with a rod of iron and dashing them to pieces as a potter's vessel. That's that promise from Psalms 2, I believe, that messianic promise of God's Son coming and reigning upon the nations of the earth. That messianic promise, and he's saying, as I will give him power of the nations, even as I received of my Father. So it's in the context of having the power to rule the nations. And then he says as well, I will give him the morning star. As something that's added on to this. So like we've seen in Revelation, Christ is referred to as the morning star. In there in 2 Peter is also the day star, which I understand it's referring to the same thing as that star you can see when the sun starts to rise. In Job, some of the other angels are referred to as the morning star. And in Isaiah 14:12, Lucifer is referred to as this day star or the morning star. So it seems to be related in all these things to this position of power, this position of glory, of splendor. And that's part of what's given to God's people when the meek shall inherit the earth, when we are made kings and priests, where we shall rule together with Christ. And that's how I understand that promise to the church at Thyatira, that is what we're given, that Christ gives us that. So far, everything we've looked at to do with stars has been in reference to heavenly beings, whether it's be the angels, Satan, or Christ. And here in Thyatira with the promise that he gives us. But can we turn to Genesis 37? And can someone read out for me verse 9 and 10? Genesis 37, verse 9 and 10.
And he dreamed yet another dream and told it his brethren and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren. And his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth?
So this is one of Joseph's dreams, and he dreams that the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bow down to him. And how is this interpreted? Who are the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars?
His father, his mother, and his 11 brethren, I believe.
Yep. So in this case, Joseph was one of 12 brothers, the 12 tribes of Israel, what it came from. And so he was one, and his other 11 brothers are pictured as being these 11 stars that bowed down themselves to him. So in this prophetic dream, the stars represented the patriarchs of the tribes of Israel. So this is one where it's actually no longer referring to heavenly beings. It's actually referring to the leaders or the founders of the tribes of Israel. And if we can turn to Jude, and if someone can read for us, Jude, verse 10 to 13.
Raging waves of the sea foaming out their own shame, wandering stars, to whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever.
And so who is Jude speaking about there?
The ungodly.
Yes, they are ungodly, but he's been a bit more specific.
Wandering.
Yeah, referred to as wandering stars. If we add a bit of the context in above, he's talking about people that are in the church. He speaks about them in verse 12 as these are spots in your feasts of charity, when they feast with you, feeding themselves without fear, clouds without water, carried out with the winds. So these aren't ungodly out of the church. These are people that are in the church. And if you jump back up to verse 4, again, he says, "For there are certain men crept in unawares, who were before ordained to this condemnation, ungodly men, turning the grace of God into lasciviousness, and denying the only Lord God and the Lord Jesus Christ." Okay, so these are people that have come into the church, okay, and these are teachers in the church. They're turning the grace of God into lasciviousness. Okay, they're teaching these things, denying the only Lord God and the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, they're bringing in false teachings, and these false teachers, these false leaders in the church, he refers to them as wandering stars. So if we jump back into Revelation 8. Now, there are other texts. We haven't by any means exhausted all the texts that speak about stars, but we've done a fairly representative survey, you could say. When we read about a great star falling from heaven, now, when we've looked at what the stars are referring to, it's wandering stars are, false leaders in the church. Joseph's dream showed us that the stars were the 12 patriarchs of the tribes of Israel, the heads of the tribes of Israel, referred to as angels, as the beings that God has, commissioned to minister unto us, whether good or bad, referred to, Christ and Lucifer themselves, also referred to as stars. So with all of that, what is the kind of consistent theme that a star seems to represent? What do all these have in common?
Well, no, they're being used as examples, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
for different types of situations.
Yes.
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
As illustrations.
Yep, they are definitely. And in every case, that what's being illustrated is they're all positions of power, of authority, of leadership. Okay, the 12 patriarchs are leaders. The false teachers had these positions of leadership. Christ and Satan being the two heads of this great controversy. Even the other angels are ones that have this position of power and authority. Colin.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Ralph reminded me about this, so that's why I turned up when I did. Good on you, Ralph. Stars, in the sense, are they is it representing peoples who, like you say, are leaders, but in the sense that they should know better than what they in reality are doing? Is that what you're sort of meaning?
Well,
not quite that way.
Not necessarily that they should know better, because there are cases, for example, as Jesus himself is referred to as the day star.
Right, of course.
Second Peter, and the morning star.
Right.
But you're right that it is this idea of leadership, okay, of authority, that it's always used to represent either people or heavenly beings that have this authority with them. And whether it's good or bad is defined as the context of where the star is. So, yes, Galen.
I just had a thought. Whether it be Christ, whether it be Lucifer, whether it be the angels, whether it be patriarchs or leaders, none of these people got this brightness, this glory, this leadership in and of themselves. All of it was given them from God the Father. I don't know if that's significant or not, but that was just a thought that floated past and I grabbed it. So they are not their own source. The source does not belong to them. Yeah, that's all I've got, sorry.
Thank you. Petra.
If I can slipstream your comment, Galen, the stars are designed to light up the night. They're designed to light up a dark place. So you've got the genuine and you've got the counterfeit. The dark place being the earth in this case.
So understand that first thing. Yes, Merlin, did you have another comment?
Yeah, I don't know how would that how would that apply to Joseph's brothers though? I don't know that fits there.
Sorry, do you want to clarify in what way? Are you referring to my statement or what Petra said?
What Petra said. What Petra said?
Do you have a comment to that, Petra?
Well, the tribes were God's way of showing his light to the world. They didn't live up to it, but it was his hope for them that they would take the role that he had given them to show light to the world. So in that spiritual Israel do the same thing. So obviously it's not their light, it's God's light coming through them. And we thought whether we have counterfeit apparent light or whether we are connected to the true light.
So that they were given sort of the commission from God to fulfill his purpose, but they chose not to live up to it. Margaret and then Colin.
Excuse me, sorry. Much the same comment. It's just that they were the patriarchs of the tribes. They were the leaders. They yes, they had a leadership role. God gave them all the leadership role.
Colin?
Yeah, just I haven't met the lady prior to the last comment, but regarding her question back to Petra, in reference to Joseph's brothers and that, they certainly looked up to Joseph in that time of need when they had to go down to Egypt. What's that word? Obeisance certainly was, they were very humbled in having to do that, and that being their only option. So I think it does apply to Joseph in that sense, or to that group in that sense.
Okay, thank you.
Really appreciate your question though, Merlin, because it's important to look at things, from as many angles as possible. And it's neat when we get together and chuck out the questions that come to mind. So awesome.
So taking this understanding of the star, jumping back into the third trumpet, when it talks about there fell a great star from heaven. So we're looking at this judgment that is going to come upon Rome in response to persecuting God's people. There is to be it's going to be at the hands of some great leaders, this great star. that is going to come. So that's the first thing we are looking at here. A great leader of this judgment that is going to come. Now, before we look at it, there's a few other things we want to look at. This star that fell, it says that the name of the star is called wormwood, and a third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the water because they were made bitter. Okay, so we've got to look at, what is wormwood. Just out of interest, does anyone know what wormwood is? Has anyone looked at that before?
It's bitter,
Can you
isn't
just
it?
give me the verse you're referring to, please?
That was Revelation 8 and verse 11.
Thank you. Sorry, Ralph.
Now, this
Yeah.
falling star, does it have anything to do with duration at all? Because they don't normally last long, do they?
No, they don't. They burn up and disappear rather quickly. Petra.
The original word just said a type of bitterness, or figuratively a calamity.
Yep, it's referring to a group of herbs. I got the name written down here that I found, and I can't pronounce it. It's one of those really long Latin names. But it's a family of herbs that was used in that area that is very bitter, and as spoken of as being sometimes poisonous as well. And we're going to look at a few Old Testament passages where this arises. First in Deuteronomy, verse 29. Sorry, chapter 29. Deuteronomy chapter 29 and verse 16 to 18.
For ye know how we have dwelt in the land of Egypt, and how we came through the nations which ye passed by. And ye have seen their abominations and their idols, wood and stone, silver and gold, which were among them. Lest there should be any among you, man or woman or family or tribe, whose heart turneth away this day from the Lord our God, to go and serve the gods of these nations. Lest there should be among you a root that beareth gall and wormwood. The alternative reading for gall I've got is a poisonful herb. So it's obviously something that's not going to do you well.
No. So again, this, as you said, gall, this poisonous herb and wormwood. What are they being used in this passage to say? What is the purpose of using here? What is the parallel that they are meaning?
It talks about bearing. Lest there, I said it once the first time, fine. Lest there should be among you a root that beareth gall and wormwood. So is it something as a result of what they're doing, that it's something? The only thing that comes to mind initially is it's bearing poisonous fruit because it's coming from the heart. Like a bad tree gives only bad fruit type situation.
Root of bitterness.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, that's all I've got.
So there's this root that bears this poisonous weed, this poisonous herb, and he's describing that's the condition he doesn't want us to be in, having this root in us that brings forth gall and wormwood. And what is the thing he has just spoken about, warning us against in the previous verses?
Idol.
Idol worship.
The worship of false gods, yeah. And he says, I took you out of the land of Egypt with all their false gods and brought you through. They're going to come into the promised land. And you've seen all the abominations of all these other nations with their idols and all of that I took you through them, okay? And I brought you through them, okay? And he wants them to realize that so that they don't go and serve these other gods, so that this root of bitterness and wormwood doesn't spring up to corrupt them and lead to their spiritual death. And so in this case, that wormwood is paralleled with the experience of serving other gods. That would be the poison that kills their religious experience. And we see that happening repeatedly throughout the Old Testament. Gayleen.
I've just seen an alternative reading in my, it's a bit of a doozy. For the word idols in verse 17, my alternative reading is dungy gods, as in like dung. Dungy gods. So I thought that was, it made me chuckle.
Yeah. That is a good way to describe them, I suppose.
Yes.
Victoria just shared a passage there from Acts 8:22 and 23. Repent therefore of this thy wickedness, and pray God, if perhaps the thoughts of thine heart may be forgiven thee, for I perceive that thou art in the gall of bitterness and in the bond of iniquity. So again, that's representing a similar thing. Wormwood being this bitter herb, and speaking about gall and bitterness, and trapped in iniquity and sin. That again leads to spiritually to death. We're going to use another couple of passages in Lamentations 3 verse 15 and then 19. Can someone read Lamentations chapter 3 verse 15 and verse 19?
All that pass by clap their hands at thee. They hiss and wag their head at the daughter of Jerusalem, saying, sorry, no, that's the wrong one, isn't it?
Yeah, Lamentations chapter 3.
Yep. Yeah, I was in chapter 2. Sorry. What, verses 15 and 19?
Yes.
So I was reading verse 2. He hath filled me with bitterness. He hath made me drunken with wormwood. Remembering mine affliction and my misery, the wormwood and the gall. Okay, that sounds better. Yeah. Sorry.
Now, just as a sort of a general question about the Book of Lamentations, why was it written? Does anyone know about the context of the Book of Lamentations? Who wrote it and why it was written?
Yeah.
Yeah, Merlene?
Jeremiah was writing poems of lament. So it was it's an acrostic of grief.
Yes.
My book says.
And what was he lamenting over?
I guess all that he was trying to tell Jerusalem, and they weren't listening. I don't know. They weren't heeding the warnings.
Yeah. God finally brought Babylon against the city of Jerusalem to conquer it and to destroy it. And so throughout Lamentations, he's weeping for the destruction that the Lord has brought upon Zion, upon his holy city.
Hmm.
And when he describes the destruction coming upon there, here in chapter 3, twice he talks about, he filled me with bitterness, made me drunk with wormwood. And then in verse 19, it's been his affliction and then the misery, the wormwood and the gall. So in this passage, wormwood is again used, it's used here to describe God's judgment upon his people who are worshipping false idols and worshipping false gods.
Mhm.
Can we turn to Jeremiah?
9 verse 15.
Yes, but if we could read from verse 13 through to 16.
Sorry, what chapter was that?
Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 13 to 16.
Thanks.
And the Lord said, because they have forsaken my law, which I set before them, and have not obeyed my voice, neither walked therein, but have walked after the imagination of their own heart, and after Balaam, which their fathers taught them. Therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will feed them, even this people with wormwood, and give them water of gall to drink. I will scatter them also among the heathen, whom neither their fathers have known, and I will send a sword after them till I have consumed them.
So again, we have that same question. What's going on in this passage, and what is wormwood being used to represent? Gayleen.
I have no idea, but a thought crossed my mind. Given gall to drink, wasn't Christ given gall to drink on the cross?
Vinegar.
I know there was vinegar, but I thought there was also gall, or one called it vinegar and one called it gall, or am I remembering incorrectly?
Matthew 27, verse 34. They gave him vinegar to drink mingled with gall.
That sounds like it.
Yeah, and it says when he tasted it thereof, he would not drink of it.
What chapter and verse was that in Matthew?
Matthew 27, verse 34.
Thank you.
Sorry, I've taken you right off track, Matthew. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Merlin.
It's not off track really, because it was referring to earlier on, there was a mention of being drunk on the gall or the wormwood or something. The reference being alcohol, and wasn't that a reference to the reason why Jesus wouldn't touch that when it was offered to him on the cross? Because it was alcoholic. It was a beverage that was given to alleviate pain or some such.
Yes, it was. I'm not sure exactly the content of it, but it was some sort of painkiller type.
So in saying that, then it would have also dulled his mental senses, and he wouldn't have wanted that.
That's right.
Yes, he needed to have that clarity of mind, because if he had have taken that and he had have, I've never been on any strong painkillers, but when the first child was born, we were in at the hospital, and my wife was just in early parts of labor. They gave her some gas, that laughing gas, and then she put on it, and she'd never done any drugs or anything her whole life, and she took a puff on it, and she was out of it. She went a bit loopy, and the nurse just started laughing and said, "Oh, we'll turn that down a bit for now." So it worked. It got rid of the pain, but her you know, her
faculties.
mental faculties also got rid of those. And Christ on the cross, you know, dying for the sins of the world. If he had have sinned once, if he had given in to Satan's temptations at all, everything would have been lost. And so he needed the full clarity of mind. You know, he could not do that, because if he had taken that and his mind had have become, you know, enfeebled, and he had have believed one of Satan's lies, hadn't discerned it, then all would have been lost. Petra.
Yeah, that word gall in Jeremiah, other than saying poisonous plant, it says probably the poppy. Also mentions hemlock and poisonous venom, but yeah, poppy might have been the first version of opium.
Mm.
Yeah, well, that makes it some type of opioid
Mm.
type drug. So here in Jeremiah, God's people, it says they've forsaken his law. They've walked in the imaginations of their own hearts after Balaam, which their fathers taught them. Now, people, what was the sin of Balaam? If you remember, we looked at this when we were looking at the 7 churches. This is a couple of months back for those of you who were with us then. Petra, you got an answer, or was your hand up from last time? Oh, there we go. Well, as you know, Balak hired Balaam to curse Israel, right? But he couldn't curse them. He says, I cannot speak anything that God has said. I cannot curse who God has blessed. But still wanting the reward that Balak offered, he gave him some advice. He told him that if you can lead these people astray from serving their God, then you'll be able to defeat them. And so he told Balak to send the Midianite woman into the camps and to entice them to come to the feasts. And so we read that in Numbers, that after Balaam failed to curse them, and the Midianite women went and they had the sin of Baal Peor. They went to worship and sacrifice to false gods and to commit adultery with the Moabite woman. And so here again, it's referring to the same thing, wandering after Balaam, which their fathers taught them. That the worshipping of false gods, this idolatry, this feasting, this fornication, that these are all the things that God's people are doing. And in response to them, he says, "This therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts, because of all their sins, I will feed them, even this people, with wormwood, and give them a water of gall to drink." That is the judgment that will come upon them. And then he carries on. So he speaks about it in these symbolic terms, and then in the literal terms, I will scatter them among the heathen. I will send a sword after them till I have consumed them. So it's speaking of this drinking of gall and eating the wormwood is this judgment that God brings upon his people for their apostasy. Petra.
Also, along those lines in Jeremiah 23:15, therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts concerning the prophets, behold, I will feed them with wormwood and make them drink the water of gall, for from the prophets of Jerusalem is profaneness gone forth unto all the land. And there's a translation there, hypocrisy. So it's the misrepresenting of him again from those who claim to be his people.
Galen.
I had another thought. Sorry. Would that punishment, the fact that God will give them wormwood and water of gall to drink, to me that brings to mind, because of, they're not walking after him. To me, it brings to mind that God will leave us with the lies that we choose.
Mm-hmm.
That and the natural consequences that happens when we thus choose. My mind's not great tonight. That verse that says that he will lead us. No, not he will lead us. With fables and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That he will leave us with the lying fables and what have you. And as a result of the fact of our choices and choosing not to follow him, as I said, the consequences of sin and idolatry and stuff sort of take their natural course, as it were. But also with this one, obviously, there's also a sword involved, which I would presume there would be other armies sent in. They would be defeated somewhere and taken captive and whatever.
Mm-hmm. And again, that's what happened when Babylon came to destroy Jerusalem. And so what we see here in Jeremiah, in both chapter 9 and chapter 23, is God talking about what would happen because of his people's sins, because of the false prophets, because of all their corruption in their teaching. And then after the destruction of Jerusalem in Lamentation, Jeremiah is again writing about it, weeping because God has brought, wormwood and gall upon his people. And so here in Jeremiah and Lamentations, we get the before and the after. And in both of it, wormwood is used to describe part of God's judgment upon his people for their corruption and their idolatry. Petra.
That also all fits with what we were looking at in the verses ahead of this in Revelation that we were talking about last week, the judgment and mercy mixed together, because in God allowing his people to experience the goodness of their choices, they have the opportunity to turn around, because it's a partial judgment. It's still mixed with mercy. There's still opportunity to turn around. So that gall in their case is actually a blessing.
Ralph.
I like that wormwood means figuratively calamity. So things are going to go wrong if you don't follow God. That's what it basically comes down to.
Things are also going to go wrong when you do follow God. So it's not only when you don't follow God. Not disagreeing with you, Ralph, but life happens in the sinful world, and all of that, all the trials that God allows to come our way, just as these people were given judgment and mercy, even the trials that we don't necessarily activate by our own choices, God still uses them to offer us to come closer to him.
And I just, like you said, what you said, Petra, made me think of I think it's Corinthians, where he's talking about the resurrection, and that being the Christian hope. And he speaks about that, and he says, for if Christ is not risen, we are of all men most miserable. That if we have no hope in the next life, then Christians is sort of the most miserable of all people, because right now all the suffering that we endure, that's all for sort of the purpose of character development, of perfection of the saints, of obtaining glory. We trust ourselves into God's hands, that he will lead us through that suffering to strengthen us and to prepare us for what he has ahead. And that's the difference between the suffering of the righteous and the suffering of the wicked. Is the suffering of the righteous is a process of refining, of purification, being tried in the fire and made pure. Petra.
Interesting thing that goes what we're just talking about here, Amos 5, 6 and 7, seek the Lord and ye shall live, lest he break out like fire in the house of Joseph and devour it, and there be none to quench it in Bethel. Ye who turn judgment to wormwood and leave off righteousness in the earth. It's interesting, ye who turn judgment to wormwood. It almost speaks to me of how we respond to the trials. If we're going to fight the trials and resent them, we make them bitter. They don't have to be bitter. They can be sweet if we allow them to take us back to God. But when we fight them, we make them more bitter. It's just like when you have intense pain and you fight it, you make it worse chemically in your body. If you don't fight it and you still seek peace with God, you actually ease it.
Okay. Now, so what we've looked at so far is this star. It's called wormwood. Okay, the star being a representative of this leader in the power in Revelation 8, verse 10 and 11, with this third angel sounding the trumpet. This great star came. Okay, so we're looking for this notable leader that comes. It's called wormwood. Okay, wormwood, as we've looked at here, is spoken of as being something that God uses to judge his people for their corruptions and their worship of false gods. And as we go on, and we've looked at these previous two trumpets, we've seen that they have been the judgments coming upon Rome, particularly the Western Roman Empire. The first was under the Ulrich, king of the Visigoths, who invaded Rome and sacked Rome in 410. And the Vandals came, took over North Africa, and again sacked Rome. The third major one, I'll share my screen here, was a figure that I'm sure everyone has heard of, Attila the Hun. I'll share my screen here. I've got a little map here. You can see there how large the actual empire of the Hun was, Attila the Hun. And these little red lines are the invasions he made into the Roman Empire. As we saw, the Visigoths came down here, sacked Rome, and then they settled over here in France. Their invasion covered about a third of the empire. Then the Vandals came down here, took over North Africa, and raided across the sea. Their invasion also covered about a third of the empire. Attila came down here into Greek, northern Italy, over there into France. Again, his attacks covered about a third of the empire. Something that was different, though, from the Huns, as opposed to the Visigoths and the Vandals, is when those empires came in, that they had particular kings that led them, but after that king died, another one came, and the actual ruler themselves was not that significant to the role they played in prophecy. After that king was dead, another king came, and the nation carried on fulfilling its role. But with the empire of Attila the Hun, he came to power, their empire spread, it did all of this. He crossed into the Roman Empire around 450 AD, but he died a few years later in 453, I think referring to what Ralph mentioned before about this being a sort of a shooting star, which normally burns up really quickly. They don't last that long. So Attila the Hun, when he started attacking Rome, 3 years later he died, and the Hun Empire returned to, well, where it came from, to what we believe is now modern day Hungary. The empire just collapsed, left Rome, and disappeared. But while they were there, they caused an incredible amount of destruction. The Huns were known for being particularly ruthless, but they didn't just destroy in their conquest. If you notice in that map that I shared, they never actually sacked Rome. They actually demanded ransom, or you could say extortion, of the Western Roman Emperor so that they wouldn't go down there and sack Rome. And it was so much gold they demanded that he was raising taxes everywhere and couldn't afford to pay a lot of his armies. And a lot of the armies that he had were mercenaries that were working for him. And it's pretty much bankrupted the empire, so it couldn't afford to pay its armies to protect it from any of the other future invasions that would happen. And so while the invasions of the Vandals and the Visigoths were damaging to Rome, and these damaging judgments, they were ones that it could have recovered from. But the damage Attila the Hun did wasn't just and the devastation he caused by sacking cities, by slaughtering the inhabitants. It was also the economic devastation that the country could not recover from. And from this point, historians seem to agree that this was the point that the fall of Rome was guaranteed and it could not recover from. And so when we look at the fall of Rome, there are these four major judgments that come upon it. The first was the Visigoths, the second the Vandals, the third was Attila the Hun. And the fourth one we're going to look at next week, which was the sort of the completion of the fall of the Roman Empire. Ralph.
So this ties nicely into our study in Daniel 8 about the daily being removed out of the way, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, indeed. And again, what he mentions in Thessalonians, that the man of sin, you know, that mystery of iniquity is already at work. But the Roman power there, this pagan Rome, was there withholding it so that it couldn't take control. But he says that it will be taken out of the way so that this mystery of iniquity could be revealed and the man of sin could rise to power. And there's this judgment's falling upon Rome, by they're judging Rome for its sort of its corruption, its part that it played in the persecution of God's people. It's also taken it out of the way for the prophecies of Daniel to continue their fulfillment. Ralph, could I ask you to have a word of prayer for us?
Yeah. Father in heaven, we do thank you so much for thy word and the way that you are making it clearer to us, dear God. We do pray that if we have opportunity, we may share it with others, that they too may be shown that thou art faithful, that thy word is true, and that you can truly be trusted. We ask now you be with us through this coming time, may our hearts continue to be lifted up to you. Our lives may be conformed to the image of Jesus, and we may lift you up with those we meet. We ask in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
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 Wonder if that bitterness had anything to do with all the taxes that were being imposed on the people.
Yes. Well, yeah, it's all the taxes that were raised on them definitely caused bitterness. People don't like paying taxes, but also the fact that they was being taxed so hard ruined the economy. And like I said, they couldn't afford to pay their mercenaries to fight in their armies. And a lot of the mercenaries were these other German tribes who then demanded land. If the Rome couldn't pay them in gold, they had to pay them in land. And that's when Rome, broke into the sort of 10 divisions of the Roman Empire, which we see in Daniel 2, the statue being divided into the 10 toes. This is when the Roman Empire started being divided after Attila, because they couldn't pay their armies in gold, so they paid them in land, and you had the 10 divisions of Rome.